What if I told you that the country that gave us tea, politeness, and queuing also pioneered concentration camps, turned human corpses into a commodity, and once nearly burned a city to the ground because nobody wanted to deal with literal mountains of human shit? Welcome to British history. The parts they definitely didn't teach you in school. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. So let's start with something appropriately disgusting: the Great Stink of 1858, which is exactly what it sounds like. London, in the mid-1800s, was the largest city in the world, with over 2 million people crammed into a relatively small area. And here's the thing about 2 million people living in one place before modern plumbing was invented. They produce an absolutely staggering amount of human waste. We're talking thousands of tons of shit per day. And London's solution to this problem was essentially to dump it all into the River Thames and hope it went away. By the 1850s, the Thames wasn't a river anymore. It was an open sewer. Dead animals floated in it. Industrial waste poured into it. And crucially, every single toilet and cesspit in London drained into it, the same river that supplied most of London's drinking water. People were literally drinking diluted sewage and wondering why cholera kept killing tens of thousands of them. Then came the summer of 1858, one of the hottest summers on record. And when you heat up millions of gallons of human sewage to 30 degrees Celsius, something magical happens. By which I mean something so horrifically disgusting that it forced the British government to actually take action for once. The smell was so bad that members of Parliament couldn't work. They soaked the curtains in the Houses of Parliament with chloride of lime, trying to mask the stench. It didn't work. MPs were literally vomiting during sessions. Keep in mind, this is the same Parliament that had spent years ignoring the cholera epidemics ravaging London's poor neighbourhoods. But cholera only killed poor people, and that was apparently fine. The smell affecting rich people's ability to do business. That required immediate action. Within 18 days of the Great Stink reaching its peak, Parliament approved the funding for Joseph Bazalgette's massive sewer system. Years of death and disease couldn't motivate them, but a few weeks of having to smell what they'd been doing to the Thames got the job done. And speaking of things the British didn't want to deal with, let's talk about body snatchers. In the early 1800s, Britain had a booming medical education industry. The problem was that Britain's laws only allowed the bodies of executed criminals to be used for dissection, and there simply weren't enough executions to meet demand. So an entire black market industry emerged. Body snatchers would dig up freshly buried corpses and sell them to anatomy schools. Because stealing a corpse wasn't technically illegal under British law at the time, stealing the clothes or jewellery from the corpse was illegal, but the body itself, apparently fine. But the really dark part came when two men in Edinburgh, William Burke and William Hare, realised something. Why go through all the effort of digging up bodies when you could just make fresh ones? In 1828, they murdered 16 people over 10 months and sold the bodies to Dr. Robert Knox. They targeted people who wouldn't be missed: the poor, prostitutes, the disabled. They'd get victims drunk, suffocate them in a way that left no marks, and deliver the bodies to Knox, who paid well and asked no questions. Burke was hanged in 1829, and in a piece of irony so perfect it seems fictional, his body was publicly dissected. Over 25,000 people came to view his corpse. His skeleton is still on display at the University of Edinburgh's medical school. The scandal finally forced Parliament to pass the Anatomy Act of 1832, which allowed unclaimed bodies from workhouses to be used for dissection. Britain solved the problem of criminals digging up corpses by making it legal to take the bodies of poor people. And since we're on the subject of Britain's treatment of poor people, let's talk about workhouses. The Victorian solution to poverty was to make being poor so completely miserable that people would do literally anything to avoid it. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 established a system of workhouses across England and Wales. Workhouses were designed to be as unpleasant as possible while keeping people technically alive. Families were separated. Men, women, and children were housed in different wings and weren't allowed to see each other. The work was brutal and pointless. Inmates would break rocks, pick oakum, which means pulling apart old rope fibers until your fingers bled, or walk treadmills for hours. The work didn't produce anything useful. It was just punishment for being poor. The conditions were so bad that people genuinely preferred to starve outside rather than enter a workhouse. Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist specifically to expose the horrors of the workhouse system, and Oliver asking for more gruel was based on the reality that workhouse food was intentionally insufficient. The workhouses lasted well into the 20th century. The last one didn't close until 1930. Speaking of Victorian Britain's treatment of children, let's talk about chimney sweeps. Britain's solution to cleaning narrow chimneys was to send small children up them. They literally sent children as young as 4 or 5 years old up chimneys that were often less than a foot wide. Master sweeps would buy or take on apprentices from workhouses. These children would be forced to climb up chimneys while the sweep lit a fire below them to encourage them to climb faster. Getting stuck in a chimney meant suffocation or burning to death. Chimney sweeps carried pins to stab the feet of children who got stuck or refused to climb. The children developed respiratory diseases from breathing soot, cancers from the constant exposure, and deformities from climbing in cramped spaces. There were alternatives. Mechanical chimney cleaning brushes existed. But British sweeps preferred children because they were cheaper. It wasn't until 1875 that the practice was actually outlawed. And speaking of the Victorian era's casual cruelty, let's discuss Bedlam. The Bethlehem Royal Hospital was Britain's first psychiatric hospital, founded in 1247. By the 18th and 19th centuries, it had become something between a hospital and a tourist attraction. People paid money to watch mentally ill patients like they were animals in a zoo. For a penny, you could visit Bedlam and watch the patients. This was considered entertainment. Londoners would bring their families to laugh at people experiencing psychotic episodes. Over 96,000 visits were recorded in 1814 alone. The treatment of patients was medieval. Patients were chained to walls, beaten, dunked in freezing water, spun in chairs until they vomited, or bled with leeches. For centuries, Britain's solution to mental illness was to chain people up and charge admission for people to laugh at them. And while we're discussing Britain's historical treatment of people it considered undesirable, let's talk about transportation to Australia. Britain had a problem. Its prisons were overflowing because British law made an absurd number of things punishable by imprisonment. The solution was to ship convicts to the other side of the world. Between 1788 and 1868, Britain transported over 160,000 convicts to Australia. The conditions on the transport ships were appalling. Convicts were chained below deck for months. Disease was rampant. Upon arrival, convicts became essentially slave labor. The crimes that got people transported were often absurdly minor. Dorothy Handland was transported for 7 years for stealing cheese. Mary Wade was transported at age 11 for stealing clothes. Britain used Australia as a dumping ground for people it didn't want to deal with. Speaking of British justice, let's talk about public executions. Britain made executions public entertainment. Hangings drew enormous crowds well into the 19th century. Tens of thousands of people would gather to watch someone die. Vendors sold food and drinks. The condemned would be paraded through the streets while crowds jeered or cheered. The execution method was brutal. The drop wasn't calculated to break the neck cleanly. Often, the condemned would slowly strangle to death over several minutes while the crowd watched. The last public execution in Britain was in 1868. The public's behaviour was so disgraceful that it finally convinced Parliament to end public hangings. not because executing people in public was inherently wrong, but because the crowds were getting too unruly. Private executions continued until 1964, and speaking of things Britain did with bodies, let's discuss anatomical dissection as punishment. The Murder Act of 1752 specified that executed murderers should either be publicly dissected or hung in chains. The corpse would be covered in tar and suspended in an iron cage at a crossroads. The hanging in chains could last for years. The body would rot while exposed to the elements. Some of these gibbets became local landmarks. People would give directions based on them. And while we're discussing medical practices, let's talk about bloodletting. For centuries, British medicine was convinced that most diseases could be cured by draining blood from patients. The treatment for almost everything was bloodletting. Fever, bleed the patient. Infection, bleed the patient. King Charles II received an enthusiastic application of medical science in 1685. When he suffered a seizure, his doctors drained a pint of blood from his arm, applied heated cups to his shoulders, cut his scalp and drained more blood, gave him enemas and various toxic substances. Over 4 days, they essentially tortured him to death while trying to cure him. Bloodletting persisted well into the 19th century, despite mounting evidence that it didn't work. Speaking of medical horrors, let's discuss trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in people's skulls. Britain was still performing trepanation in the 19th century as treatment for mental illness, epilepsy, or headaches. Surgeons would use a cylindrical saw to cut through the skull while the patient was awake or minimally sedated. The patient would feel the saw cutting through bone. The success rate was poor. Infection was common. Brain damage was a frequent outcome. Now let's talk about the opium trade. In the 19th century, Britain wanted tea from China, but China didn't want British manufactured goods. This created a trade deficit. The solution? Get millions of Chinese people addicted to opium, then sell them opium to balance the trade. British merchants, protected by the Royal Navy, deliberately created a massive opium addiction epidemic in China. When Chinese officials seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British opium in 1839, the British response was to start a war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which gave Britain Hong Kong. When disputes arose again in the 1850s, Britain started the Second Opium War. Let's be clear about what happened. China tried to stop drug dealers from poisoning their population. Britain responded by invading China and forcing them to accept the drug trade. By the late 19th century, an estimated 10% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. Britain fought 2 wars to protect drug dealers' right to addict China to opium. Speaking of medical horrors, let's discuss trepanation, which is the practice of drilling holes in people's skulls. This wasn't a medieval practice that died out quickly. Britain was still performing trepanation in the 19th century, sometimes as treatment for mental illness, epilepsy, or headaches. The theory was that drilling a hole in the skull would release evil spirits or relieve pressure on the brain. The procedure was exactly as terrible as it sounds. Surgeons would use a trephine, a cylindrical saw, to cut through the skull while the patient was awake or minimally sedated. This was before anesthesia became common. The patient would feel the saw cutting through bone. The success rate was poor. Infection was common. Brain damage was a frequent outcome. And yet doctors kept doing it because it was established practice. Archaeological evidence shows that some patients survived multiple trepanations. Their skulls show healed holes, meaning they lived long enough for the bone to start regrowing. Whether they survived because of or despite the procedure is unclear, but the fact that anyone volunteered for it multiple times suggests either incredible desperation or that the alternative treatments were even worse. The practice gradually declined as medicine improved, and doctors realized that drilling random holes in skulls didn't actually cure mental illness or headaches. But trepanation persisted in some form into the early 20th century, particularly in cases of skull fractures or brain injuries, where it actually had some medical justification. The transition from drilling holes to release demons to drilling holes to relieve pressure from brain injuries took a very long time. Now let's talk about something Britain is particularly famous for, but likes to downplay: the opium trade. In the 19th century, Britain had a problem. They wanted tea from China, lots of tea. Britain was importing enormous quantities of Chinese tea, and they had to pay for it in silver, because China didn't want British manufactured goods. This created a trade deficit that made British merchants very unhappy. The solution? Get millions of Chinese people addicted to opium, then sell them opium to balance the trade. This is not an exaggeration. British merchants, protected by the British government and the Royal Navy, deliberately created a massive opium addiction epidemic in China to solve a trade imbalance. It's one of the most cynically evil commercial enterprises in history, and Britain prosecuted it with enthusiastic efficiency. The British East India Company grew opium in India, specifically in Bengal. They processed it and shipped it to China, where Chinese smugglers would distribute it, despite Chinese government attempts to ban the drug. The Chinese government knew opium was devastating their population. They passed laws against it. They confiscated and destroyed opium shipments. They executed dealers. None of it worked because the British kept shipping more opium and because the profit margins were enormous. In 1839, Chinese officials seized and destroyed over 1,000 tons of British opium in Canton. The British response was to start a war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. The British Navy bombarded Chinese ports, blockaded the coast, and sailed up the Yangtze River. China's military technology was no match for British gunboats. China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanking, which gave Britain Hong Kong, opened 5 ports to British trade, and required China to pay reparations for the destroyed opium. Let's be clear about what happened. China tried to stop drug dealers from poisoning their population. Britain responded by invading China and forcing them to accept the drug trade. When disputes arose again in the 1850s, Britain started the Second Opium War, dragged France in as an ally, and further humiliated China with the Treaty of Tientsin. The opium trade devastated China. By the late 19th century, an estimated 10% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. The social and economic costs were catastrophic. But British merchants made enormous profits, and the British government collected tax revenue from the opium trade in India. So the trade continued until the early 20th century, when international pressure and Chinese resistance finally started to end it. Britain fought 2 wars to protect drug dealers' right to addict China to opium. This isn't ancient history. This happened in the Victorian era, the same period when Britain was building railways, hosting world's fairs, and considering itself the height of civilization. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. And speaking of British colonial exploitation, we should discuss the Irish potato famine, because Britain's response to Ireland starving to death reveals some deeply dark truths about imperial priorities. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland's potato crop failed repeatedly due to blight. Potatoes were the staple food for most Irish people, particularly the poor. When the crop failed, people starved. Here's the thing, though. Ireland wasn't experiencing a food shortage. Ireland was producing plenty of food during the famine. Wheat, oats, cattle, pigs, and other food were being grown and raised throughout the famine years. But that food was being exported to Britain. Ships laden with food left Irish ports while people in those same ports starved to death. The British government, which controlled Ireland, allowed and encouraged these exports to continue throughout the famine. The logic was pure free market ideology. The government believed that interfering with the market would make things worse, that food prices should be determined by supply and demand, and that providing relief would create dependency. So while people died in ditches, the government congratulated itself on maintaining economic principles. Some officials explicitly stated that the famine was divine providence, meant to reduce Ireland's population and teach the Irish the value of hard work. Charles Trevelyan, who was in charge of famine relief, wrote that the famine was an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population and a direct stroke of an all-wise and all-merciful providence. He believed Irish suffering was deserved and beneficial. This wasn't a fringe view. This was official government policy, guided by a belief that Irish people were somehow morally inferior and needed to be disciplined by market forces and divine punishment. The relief efforts that were provided were deliberately inadequate and designed to be as unpleasant as possible. Public works programs paid starvation wages for hard labor. Soup kitchens were established, but then shut down to avoid creating dependency. The corn that was imported from America was sold rather than distributed, and it was a type of corn that required extensive processing that most Irish people couldn't do. The British government spent more money on Irish coercion and maintaining order than on famine relief. By the time the famine ended, over 1 million Irish people had died. Another 1 million had emigrated, many to America. Ireland's population dropped by 25% and never recovered. The cultural and demographic scars lasted for generations, and Britain's official response was essentially that it was unfortunate, but probably for the best. The Irish famine wasn't a natural disaster. It was a policy choice. Britain could have stopped food exports. They could have provided adequate relief. They chose not to because helping the Irish poor was seen as economically inefficient and morally hazardous. The decision to let 1 million people starve rather than interfere with market forces or acknowledge any responsibility for a colonized population's welfare is one of the darkest chapters in British history. And speaking of British colonial violence, let's discuss something that should be much more famous than it is. Britain invented concentration camps. Not Nazi Germany, Britain. During the Second Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902, Britain rounded up Boer civilians, mostly women and children, and imprisoned them in camps. The stated purpose was to prevent them from supporting Boer guerrillas. The actual effect was mass death. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and undersupplied. Disease ran rampant. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery swept through the camps. Food was inadequate. Medical care was minimal. The British commander, Lord Kitchener, implemented a scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms and destroying crops to deny resources to guerrillas. The displaced civilians ended up in concentration camps where conditions were atrocious. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, along with over 14,000 black Africans who were imprisoned in separate camps. The death rate in some camps exceeded 30%. Children died at horrifying rates. One report found that in some camps, the death rate for children under 5 was over 50%. These weren't accidental deaths from unforeseen circumstances. They were the predictable result of cramming people into camps without adequate food, water, sanitation, or medical care. Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare campaigner, visited the camps and exposed the conditions in Britain. Her reports caused a scandal. The government was forced to improve conditions somewhat, but the camps continued operating until the war ended. The British government defended the camps as military necessity and denied that conditions were as bad as reported, right up until the evidence became overwhelming. The Boer War concentration camps established a precedent. They showed that mass civilian internment could be used as a military tactic. Later concentration camps in the 20th century, including Nazi camps, drew on this model. Britain pioneered the use of concentration camps as a tool of warfare and colonial control. That's not a proud legacy, which is probably why it's not taught prominently in British schools. After the war, Britain annexed the Boer republics and incorporated them into what would become South Africa. The concentration camps were closed, and everyone tried to forget they'd happened. But the psychological and demographic impact on the Boer community was profound. An entire generation of children died or grew up traumatized in British concentration camps. This contributed to Afrikaner nationalism and eventually to apartheid, creating a cycle of violence that lasted another century. And while we're discussing British military innovations, let's talk about the use of chemical weapons in World War I. Britain wasn't the first to use poison gas. That was Germany at Ypres in 1915. But Britain enthusiastically adopted it and developed its own chemical weapons program. The most infamous British contribution was mustard gas, first used by the British in 1917. Mustard gas was horrific. It didn't kill quickly. It caused severe chemical burns, blistered the skin and lungs, and led to a slow, agonizing death. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas would suffer for days or weeks, their skin peeling off, their lungs filling with fluid, their eyes burning. Many who survived were left permanently disabled, blinded, or with destroyed respiratory systems. The British War Office knew how horrible mustard gas was. That was the point. The goal was to inflict maximum suffering on enemy soldiers. The psychological impact of gas warfare was considered as valuable as the physical casualties. Soldiers terrified of gas attacks were less effective fighters. The fact that gas drifted and could affect your own troops or civilians was seen as an acceptable risk. Over 90,000 soldiers died from gas attacks in World War I. Over 1 million were injured. The long-term health effects on survivors were catastrophic. And after the war, when the international community tried to ban chemical weapons, Britain resisted. They only agreed to the Geneva Protocol in 1925 after significant pressure. And even then, Britain reserved the right to use chemical weapons against enemies who weren't signatories. Britain continued to develop and stockpile chemical weapons after World War I. They used chemical weapons in Iraq in the 1920s against Kurdish and Arab rebellions. Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, explicitly approved the use of poison gas against Iraqi tribes, writing that he was strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. The idea that chemical weapons were acceptable to use against colonized populations, but not against European armies, tells you everything you need to know about British attitudes toward empire. The chemical weapons program continued through World War II. Britain manufactured massive quantities of mustard gas and other agents, though they were never used in combat, largely because both sides feared retaliation. After the war, Britain disposed of chemical weapons by dumping them in the ocean, which created environmental hazards that persist today. Munitions containing poison gas still wash up on beaches occasionally, a literal toxic legacy of British chemical warfare. Speaking of toxic legacies, let's discuss the Peterloo Massacre, which was the time the British government sent cavalry to charge into a peaceful protest and kill their own citizens. In 1819, a crowd of 60,000 to 80,000 people gathered at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand parliamentary reform. Most of the crowd were working-class people who had no right to vote. They wanted representation, an end to the Corn Laws that made food expensive, and various democratic reforms. The protest was peaceful. Families attended, people brought children. The speakers called for peaceful reform and specifically told the crowd to remain calm and orderly. The local magistrates, terrified by the size of the crowd and paranoid about revolution after recent events in France, decided the gathering was illegal and ordered the speakers arrested. They sent in the local yeomanry, a cavalry unit of part-time soldiers, to arrest the speakers. The yeomanry were mostly wealthy merchants and landowners, many of whom were drunk. They rode into the crowd with sabres drawn. When the crowd didn't immediately disperse, which is difficult when you're packed shoulder to shoulder with 80,000 people, the cavalry started slashing at people indiscriminately. The magistrates then sent in the professional cavalry of the 15th Hussars to support the yeomanry. Trained soldiers charged into a crowd of unarmed civilians. 15 people were killed, including 2 women and a child. Over 600 were injured, many with saber wounds. People were trampled by horses. Some were crushed in the panic to escape. The government's response was to congratulate the magistrates and cavalry for maintaining order. The Home Secretary sent a thank you letter praising their action. Parliament passed the 6 Acts, which severely restricted public meetings and freedom of the press. The protesters were blamed for causing the violence by gathering in the first place. None of the cavalry or magistrates were prosecuted. Some of the protest organizers were arrested and imprisoned for sedition. The massacre was called Peterloo as a bitter joke, comparing it to the Battle of Waterloo, where British soldiers had fought Napoleon 4 years earlier. The message was clear. The British government would use the same military force against its own citizens, demanding rights as it would against foreign enemies. The right to vote, to assemble, to petition the government, those weren't rights. Those were privileges the government could revoke with cavalry charges. Peterloo galvanized the reform movement, but actual reform took decades. The Reform Act of 1832 modestly expanded voting rights, but still excluded most working-class men. It wasn't until 1918 that all men could vote, and 1928 before women had equal voting rights. From Peterloo in 1819 to universal suffrage in 1928 is over a century. Britain spent 100 years, slowly, grudgingly, granting its citizens rights they should have had from the beginning. And speaking of things Britain took far too long to address, we need to talk about child labour in factories. During the Industrial Revolution, Britain pioneered industrial manufacturing, which is presented as progress. What's less often discussed is that British factories were powered largely by children. Children, as young as 5 or 6, worked 12 to 16-hour days in textile mills, coal mines, and factories. The conditions were appalling. Children operated dangerous machinery with no safety equipment. Factory owners preferred children because they had small hands for detailed work, could crawl into tight spaces, and could be paid almost nothing. Children who fell asleep at machines would have their heads dunked in water to wake them up. Children who worked too slowly were beaten. The accidents were horrific. Children lost fingers, hands, and limbs in machinery. They were crushed by equipment. They fell into vats of chemicals. They were scalped when their hair got caught in machines. The factory owner's response to these injuries was typically to fire the injured child, since they could no longer work effectively. In coal mines, children worked as trappers, sitting in darkness for hours, opening and closing ventilation doors. They worked as hurriers, crawling through narrow tunnels, hauling coal carts. The tunnels were often less than 3 feet high. Children crawled on their hands and knees, sometimes with coal carts strapped to their waist or around their neck, pulling hundreds of pounds of coal through pitch-black tunnels filled with coal dust and sometimes water. One parliamentary report from 1842 described children as young as 6 working in conditions of extreme heat, darkness, and danger. Girls worked half naked because of the heat. Children developed severe respiratory problems from the coal dust. Spinal deformities from working in cramped positions. Many died in mine collapses or explosions. Parliament knew about these conditions for decades before acting. The first meaningful legislation, the Factories Act of 1833, only prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills and limited children aged 9 to 13 to 8-hour days. That was considered progressive reform, letting 9-year-olds work 8-hour days instead of 12. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited women and boys under 10 from working underground in coal mines. Boys over 10 could still work in the mines. Girls could work above ground in brutal conditions. These laws were poorly enforced. Factory inspectors were few and overworked. Factory owners ignored the regulations with little consequence. It took decades of additional legislation to slowly raise the minimum working age and reduce working hours for children. Britain didn't prohibit children under 12 from full-time work until the Education Act of 1880, nearly 50 years after the first Factory Act. Millions of British children spent their childhoods in mines and factories. They never learned to read or write. They never played. They just worked until they were broken or dead. And Britain called this progress and economic development. The factories that drove British industrial dominance were built on the backs of children working themselves to death for pennies. The fact that this happened during the Victorian era, when Britain was at the height of its power and thought of itself as the pinnacle of civilization, should tell you something about how civilizations define progress. Massive industrial output and imperial expansion built on the exploitation of children. That's the foundation of modern British prosperity, though it's not usually taught that way in schools. And speaking of British colonial exploitation, we should discuss the Irish potato famine. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland's potato crop failed repeatedly due to blight. Potatoes were the staple food for most Irish people. When the crop failed, people starved. But here's the thing, Ireland wasn't experiencing a food shortage. Ireland was producing plenty of food during the famine. Wheat, oats, cattle, and other food were being grown throughout the famine years. But that food was being exported to Britain. Ships laden with food left Irish ports, while people in those same ports starved to death. The British government allowed and encouraged these exports to continue throughout the famine. The logic was pure free market ideology. The government believed that interfering with the market would make things worse. Some officials explicitly stated that the famine was divine providence meant to reduce Ireland's population. Charles Trevelyan, who was in charge of famine relief, believed Irish suffering was deserved and beneficial. The relief efforts that were provided were deliberately inadequate. Public works programs paid starvation wages. Soup kitchens were established, but then shut down to avoid creating dependency. By the time the famine ended, over 1 million Irish people had died. Another million had emigrated. Ireland's population dropped by 25% and never recovered. The Irish famine wasn't a natural disaster. It was a policy choice. Britain could have stopped food exports. They chose not to because helping the Irish poor was seen as economically inefficient. The decision to let 1 million people starve rather than interfere with market forces is one of the darkest chapters in British history. And speaking of British colonial violence, let's discuss something that should be much more famous than it is. Britain invented concentration camps. Not Nazi Germany, Britain. During the Second Boer War in South Africa, from 1899 to 1902, Britain rounded up Boer civilians, mostly women and children, and imprisoned them in camps. The stated purpose was to prevent them from supporting Boer guerrillas. The actual effect was mass death. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and undersupplied. Disease ran rampant. Measles, typhoid, and dysentery swept through the camps. Food was inadequate. Medical care was minimal. Over 26,000 Boer women and children died in these camps, along with over 14,000 Black Africans who were imprisoned in separate camps. The death rate in some camps exceeded 30%. Children died at horrifying rates. One report found that in some camps, the death rate for children under 5 was over 50%. Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare campaigner, visited the camps and exposed the conditions. Her reports caused a scandal. The government was forced to improve conditions somewhat, but the camps continued operating until the war ended. The British government defended the camps as military necessity, Britain pioneered the use of concentration camps as a tool of warfare and colonial control. That's not a proud legacy. And while we're discussing British military innovations, let's talk about the use of chemical weapons in World War I. Britain wasn't the first to use poison gas. That was Germany, but Britain enthusiastically adopted it and developed its own chemical weapons program. The most infamous British contribution was mustard gas, first used in 1917. Mustard gas was horrific. It didn't kill quickly. It caused severe chemical burns, blistered the skin and lungs, and led to a slow, agonizing death. Soldiers exposed to mustard gas would suffer for days or weeks, their skin peeling off, their lungs filling with fluid, their eyes burning. Many who survived were left permanently disabled, blinded, or with destroyed respiratory systems. The British War Office knew how horrible mustard gas was. That was the point. The goal was to inflict maximum suffering on enemy soldiers. Over 90,000 soldiers died from gas attacks in World War I. Over 1 million were injured, and after the war, when the international community tried to ban chemical weapons, Britain resisted. They only agreed to the Geneva Protocol in 1925 after significant pressure. Britain continued to develop and stockpile chemical weapons after World War I. They used chemical weapons in Iraq in the 1920s against Kurdish and Arab rebellions. Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, explicitly approved the use of poison gas against Iraqi tribes, writing that he was strongly in favor of using poisoned gas against uncivilized tribes. The idea that chemical weapons were acceptable to use against colonized populations but not against European armies tells you everything you need to know about British attitudes toward empire. Speaking of Britain's relationship with Iraq, let's talk about how Britain created that country in the first place. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Britain and France divided up the Middle East between themselves in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain took control of Mesopotamia, the area that's now Iraq, and they created Iraq as a country by drawing lines on a map, with basically no regard for the people actually living there. The British combined three Ottoman provinces with completely different populations: the Shia Arabs in the south, the Sunni Arabs in the center, and the Kurds in the north. These groups had different religions, different cultures, different languages in some cases, and different political interests. Britain shoved them all into one country and installed a king, Faisal I, who wasn't even from Iraq. He was from the Hejaz, in what's now Saudi Arabia. The Iraqi people didn't want to be ruled by Britain. In 1920, there was a massive revolt against British rule. The British response was brutal. They used aerial bombardment against villages, a tactic that was relatively new at the time. Winston Churchill, who was colonial secretary, advocated for using poison gas against the rebels. The revolt was crushed, but it cost Britain significant money and lives. Britain eventually granted Iraq nominal independence in 1932, but they maintained significant control over Iraqi oil and foreign policy. The borders Britain drew, combining populations that didn't want to be combined, created tensions that persist to this day. The sectarian violence in Iraq, the Kurdish independence movements, a lot of that traces back to Britain's decision to create Iraq as a country for their own administrative convenience, without caring about the people who lived there. And speaking of Britain drawing borders with no regard for the people affected, let's discuss the partition of India. In 1947, Britain finally granted independence to India after centuries of colonial rule. But they didn't just leave. They divided India into two countries, India and Pakistan, based primarily on religion. Hindu-majority areas would become India. Muslim-majority areas would become Pakistan. The problem was that religious communities weren't neatly separated geographically. Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs lived mixed together across the subcontinent. Britain drew a line, called it a border, and told millions of people they were now on the wrong side. The result was one of the largest and most violent mass migrations in human history. Between 10 and 20 million people were displaced. Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan fled to India. Muslims in India fled to Pakistan. And during this migration, somewhere between 200,000 and 2 million people were killed in communal violence. The estimates vary widely because nobody was keeping accurate count of the bodies. Entire trains arrived at stations filled with corpses. Villages were massacred. Women were abducted and raped by the thousands. The man in charge of drawing the border was Sir Cyril Radcliffe, a British lawyer who had never been to India before and knew nothing about the region. He was given 5 weeks to draw a border dividing 400 million people. He worked from outdated maps and census data. He never visited most of the areas he was dividing. He drew lines that split villages, farms, and families. The Radcliffe Line, as it's called, created a border that made no geographic or economic sense and maximized human suffering. Britain knew the partition would cause violence. They had intelligence reports warning of potential massacres. They went ahead anyway because they wanted out of India quickly and didn't want to deal with the consequences of their centuries of colonial rule. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, moved up the date of independence by almost a year, giving even less time for preparation. The British left and South Asia burned. The partition created Pakistan as a country split into 2 parts, East and West Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of Indian territory. This made no sense. East and West Pakistan had nothing in common except religion, and even that was practiced differently in the 2 regions. In 1971, East Pakistan fought a war of independence and became Bangladesh. That war killed between 300,000 and 3 million people, depending on whose estimates you believe. Britain's botched partition led to multiple wars and decades of sectarian violence. And while we're on the subject of Britain's colonial legacy, let's talk about Kenya and the Mau Mau uprising. In the 1950s, Kenya was a British colony. British settlers had taken the best farmland, particularly in the highlands, and forced the native Kikuyu people onto reserves or into working as labourers on British farms. The Kikuyu people, unsurprisingly, weren't happy about this. The Mau Mau Rebellion started in 1952 as a resistance movement against British colonial rule. The British response was to declare a state of emergency and implement a system of detention camps and villages. They rounded up hundreds of thousands of Kikuyu people and imprisoned them without trial. The camps were supposed to be for rehabilitation, which is a nice way of saying they were designed to break people through torture and forced labor. The conditions in the camps were horrific. Detainees were beaten, tortured, sexually assaulted, and forced to work in brutal conditions. The torture techniques included electric shocks, burning with cigarettes, sexual assault, and being forced to eat feces. One particularly horrific method involved castrating male prisoners with pliers. These weren't rogue soldiers acting without authorization. This was systematic policy approved at high levels of the British government. Over 150,000 Kikuyu people were detained in these camps. Thousands were killed, though the exact number is disputed because Britain destroyed many of the records. The British government classified documents about the camps and denied for decades that torture had been widespread. It wasn't until 2011 that the British government admitted that detainees had been tortured and agreed to compensate survivors. The Mau Mau Rebellion was used to justify extreme violence against Kikuyu civilians. Villages were burned. Collective punishment was common. If the British suspected a village of supporting the Mau Mau, they might round up all the men and execute them. The ratio of Mau Mau fighters killed to British security forces killed was about 50-1, which tells you something about the asymmetry of the violence. Britain granted Kenya independence in 1963, but only after crushing the rebellion through methods that would be recognized as war crimes today. The legacy of the Mau Mau period, the violence, the torture, the detention camps, created trauma that lasted for generations, and Britain tried to cover it up for over 50 years. Speaking of things Britain tried to cover up, let's discuss the Bengal famine of 1943. During World War II, while Britain was fighting Nazi Germany, British colonial policies caused a famine in Bengal that killed at least 3 million people. Some estimates put the death toll as high as 4 million. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was a policy-induced famine. Bengal was a major food-producing region, but the British colonial administration implemented policies that made food scarce for Bengalis. They requisitioned rice and boats as part of the war effort, making it difficult for people to transport or access food. They prioritized feeding British soldiers and British civilians over Indian civilians. When famine conditions started, the British government refused to divert ships to bring food to Bengal because those ships were needed for the war effort. Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister at the time, has been widely quoted as being dismissive of the famine. When officials warned him about the famine's severity, he reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. He blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits. When Australia offered to send wheat to Bengal, Churchill's cabinet rejected the offer. People starved in the streets of Calcutta. Bodies piled up on roadsides. Families sold their children because they couldn't feed them. Women were forced into prostitution to survive. The famine created such desperation that there are documented cases of cannibalism, and the British government's response was to deny the severity of the crisis and prioritise British interests over Indian lives. After the war, Britain conducted an inquiry into the famine. The Famine Inquiry Commission found that the famine was man-made and avoidable, caused by policy failures rather than crop failure. But the inquiry was limited in scope, and many of the responsible officials faced no consequences. The Bengal famine is barely taught in British schools. Most British people have never heard of it. And since we're discussing British famines in India, we should mention that the Bengal famine of 1943 wasn't the first. There were multiple famines in India during British colonial rule. Estimates suggest that between 12 and 29 million Indians died in famines during the British colonial period. These famines were often caused or worsened by British economic policies. The British Empire extracted wealth from India through taxation and trade policies that impoverished the population. They destroyed India's textile industry to benefit British manufacturers. They forced farmers to grow cash crops like indigo and opium instead of food crops. They built railways primarily to move resources to ports for export, not to help Indian commerce. When famines occurred, the British government's response was often guided by free market ideology and a belief that interfering would make things worse. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 killed between 5.5 and 8.2 million people in India. The famine was caused by drought, but British policies made it much worse. The British administration continued to export grain from famine-affected areas. They refused to provide relief because they believed it would create dependency. The Viceroy of India, Lord Lytton, held a massive feast for 60,000 people to celebrate Queen Victoria becoming Empress of India, while millions of Indians starved. The pattern repeated in famine after famine. Drought or crop failure would create food scarcity. British policies would prevent relief efforts or continue food exports. Millions would die. The British government would conduct an inquiry, acknowledge some policy failures, and then do essentially the same thing in the next famine. Speaking of British extraction of wealth, let's talk about the East India Company. Before the British government directly ruled India, the East India Company controlled large parts of the subcontinent. The company was a private corporation with its own army. Let that sink in. A corporation with its own military force that conquered and ruled territories. The East India Company started as a trading company in 1600. chartered by Queen Elizabeth I. Over time, it became increasingly involved in Indian politics and warfare. The company made alliances with local rulers, fought wars against others, and gradually took control of more territory. By the mid-17th century, the company effectively ruled Bengal, one of the richest provinces in India. The company's rule was extractive and brutal. They collected taxes, monopolized trade, and drained wealth from India to Britain. The company's servants became incredibly wealthy through corruption and exploitation. Robert Clive, who established company rule in Bengal, returned to Britain with a personal fortune, equivalent to hundreds of millions of pounds today. The company's policies directly caused the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed about 10 million people, roughly one-third of Bengal's population. The company had raised taxes and collected them ruthlessly, even as famine conditions developed. They prioritized revenue collection over famine relief. The death toll was staggering, but the company's shareholders still received their dividends. The East India Company's rule became so corrupt and brutal that even the British government, not known for its humanitarian concerns, had to step in. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the British Crown took direct control of India from the company. But the company had already spent over 2 centuries extracting wealth and creating the structures of exploitation that British colonial rule would continue. And speaking of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, let's discuss how Britain responded to that. The rebellion, also called the Sepoy Mutiny, started when Indian soldiers in the company's army refused orders. The rebellion spread quickly and threatened British control of India. The British response was a campaign of revenge and terror designed to crush resistance permanently. British forces recaptured Delhi, the rebel capital, after a siege. When the city fell, British soldiers went on a rampage, killing thousands of civilians. The official British policy was to show no mercy. Captured rebels were executed in creative and brutal ways. Some were tied to cannons and blown apart, a method called blowing from a gun. This was done publicly to terrorize the population. Villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were burned. Collective punishment was common. If rebels came from a village, the entire village might be punished, its inhabitants killed or displaced. The British killed far more Indian civilians during the suppression of the rebellion than Indian rebels killed British civilians during the rebellion itself. The rebellion gave the British an excuse to reshape Indian society to prevent future uprisings. They disbanded the Bengal army and reorganized the military to ensure that different ethnic and religious groups were separated, making coordinated rebellion more difficult. They strengthened racial segregation and reduced Indian participation in administration. The message was clear: resistance would be met with overwhelming brutality. The British called it the Mutiny and portrayed it as a rebellion by disloyal soldiers. Indian historians call it the First War of Independence. Regardless of the name, the British response showed how far they would go to maintain control. Thousands were killed in executions and massacres. The rebellion failed, and British rule in India continued for another 90 years. Speaking of British violence in maintaining empire, let's discuss the Amritsar Massacre of 1919. After World War I, Indian independence movements were growing stronger. Britain responded with repressive laws. The Rowlatt Acts allowed the British to imprison people without trial and suppress political activity. Indians protested these laws. On April 13, 1919, a large crowd gathered in Jallianwala Bagh, a walled garden in Amritsar, for a peaceful protest. The gathering included families and children. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer arrived with soldiers, blocked the exits, and ordered his troops to fire into the crowd without warning. The soldiers fired continuously for about 10 minutes, shooting 1,650 rounds of ammunition into the trapped crowd. The official death toll was 379, but that's almost certainly an undercount. Many estimates put the real number at over 1,000. Hundreds more were wounded. People trampled each other trying to escape. Some jumped into a well to avoid the bullets and drowned. Dyer prevented medical aid from reaching the wounded for hours. He later testified that he would have used machine guns if he could have gotten them into the garden. Dyer's justification was that he wanted to create a moral and widespread effect, by which he meant he wanted to terrorize Indians into submission. He succeeded in creating terror, but he also created outrage. The massacre galvanized the Indian independence movement. It showed that British rule was maintained through violence and that British claims of bringing civilization to India were nonsense. The British government's response was telling. Dyer was relieved of his command, but he faced no criminal charges. Many British people defended him as a hero who had prevented another rebellion. The House of Lords passed a motion supporting him. British residents of India raised money for him. He returned to Britain and lived comfortably until his death in 1927. The message was that killing hundreds of unarmed Indian civilians was regrettable, perhaps, but not really criminal. And speaking of Britain's treatment of independence movements, let's talk about what they did in Malaya during the 1950s. The Malayan Emergency was a guerrilla war between British colonial forces and the Malayan National Liberation Army. The British response included forced relocations, detention without trial, and systematic torture. Britain created new villages, which were essentially concentration camps, and forcibly relocated hundreds of thousands of ethnic Chinese Malayans into them. The villages were surrounded by barbed wire and guards. People needed passes to leave. The stated reason was to cut off the guerrillas from support, but the actual effect was to imprison entire communities for being the wrong ethnicity. The British also used systematic torture during interrogations. Detainees were beaten, waterboarded, electrocuted, and subjected to other forms of torture to extract information. These weren't isolated incidents. This was official policy. The torture was so routine that the methods were taught to interrogators as standard procedure. Speaking of British interrogation techniques, let's discuss what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. In 1971, the British government introduced internment without trial in Northern Ireland. They arrested hundreds of suspected IRA members and sympathizers without charging them with any crime. During interrogation, detainees were subjected to what Britain called the 5 techniques. The 5 techniques were wall standing, where detainees were forced to stand in stress positions for hours; hooding, where black hoods were placed over detainees' heads for extended periods; subjection to loud noise, sleep deprivation, and deprivation of food and water. These techniques were designed to break down detainees psychologically without leaving physical marks. In 1978, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that the 5 techniques constituted an inhuman and degrading treatment. Britain was found to have violated human rights. But nobody was prosecuted. The techniques had been approved at high levels of government. The use of torture in Northern Ireland was policy, not aberration. And while we're on Northern Ireland, let's talk about Bloody Sunday. On January 30th, 1972, British soldiers shot 26 unarmed civilians during a peaceful protest march in Derry. 13 people died immediately. Another died later from his injuries. The victims included teenagers. Some were shot while running away. Some were shot while trying to help the wounded. The British Army claimed they were fired upon first and were returning fire at gunmen. This was a lie. Multiple investigations eventually proved that the victims were unarmed. Soldiers had opened fire on peaceful protesters without justification. The Savile Inquiry, which reported in 2010 after 12 years of investigation, concluded that the killings were unjustified and unjustifiable. It took 38 years for the British government to apologise. Prime Minister David Cameron said in 2010 that the shootings were wrong and unjustified. But by then, most of the soldiers involved had retired. Only one soldier has faced prosecution, and that case is still ongoing. Bloody Sunday showed that the British Army would shoot its own citizens and then lie about it for decades. Speaking of British military violence, let's discuss the Dresden bombing in World War II. In February 1945, British and American bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries on Dresden, a German city with limited military value. The bombing created a firestorm that killed between 22,000 and 25,000 people, most of them civilians. The city was packed with refugees fleeing the Soviet advance. The bombing came in waves designed to maximize casualties. The first wave destroyed buildings and infrastructure. The second wave, arriving hours later, targeted rescue workers and firefighters trying to save survivors. The use of incendiary bombs was deliberately calculated to create fires that would merge into a firestorm, making escape impossible. Dresden's military significance was questionable. It had some industry and was a transport hub, but it wasn't a major military target. The bombing was designed to terrorize the German population and demonstrate Allied air power to the approaching Soviet forces. Arthur Harris, head of RAF Bomber Command, was a strong proponent of area bombing, which meant targeting entire cities rather than specific military objectives. The bombing of German cities wasn't limited to Dresden. British bombers systematically destroyed German urban areas throughout the war, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of other cities were subjected to similar treatment. The stated goal was to break German morale and reduce industrial capacity. The actual effect was to kill vast numbers of civilians while German war production continued. After the war, there was some debate about whether the bombing campaign had been necessary or effective. Harris argued it shortened the war and saved Allied lives. Critics argued it was a war crime that killed civilians without significantly affecting Germany's ability to fight. Churchill distanced himself from the bombing campaign after the war, refusing to award Harris a peerage and omitting mention of Bomber Command in his victory speech. And speaking of questionable British actions in World War II, let's talk about the Bengal famine again, but this time focus on Churchill's role. Churchill was Prime Minister during the famine. He received multiple warnings about the severity of the crisis. Officials in India and British administrators begged for food aid. Churchill refused to prioritize shipping food to Bengal. Churchill's reasoning was that ships were needed for the war effort and couldn't be spared for famine relief. Except Britain was shipping food from Australia to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean and Europe. Ships were available. They just weren't directed to India. When officials pressed Churchill on the famine, he responded with racist remarks about Indians breeding like rabbits and asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet. Churchill believed in racial hierarchies. He thought white British lives were worth more than Indian lives. He saw Indians as inferior and their suffering as less important than British strategic interests. His actions during the Bengal famine killed millions of people through deliberate policy choices. But he's remembered as a war hero who saved Britain from Nazi Germany. The millions of Indians who died under his watch are barely mentioned. Speaking of things barely mentioned, let's discuss the Chagos Islands. In the 1960s and 70s, Britain forcibly removed the entire population of the Chagos Islands to make way for a US military base. The Chagosians had lived on the islands for generations. Britain decided their home would be better used as a military facility. The British government simply expelled them. They were told they had to leave, put on ships, and dumped in Mauritius and the Seychelles with minimal compensation. Their homes were destroyed, their pets were killed. About 2,000 people were forcibly displaced from their homeland. The British government claimed the islands had no permanent population, which was a lie. The Chagossians have been fighting to return ever since. Multiple court cases have ruled in their favour, stating the expulsion was illegal. The British government keeps appealing and finding ways to prevent their return. In 2019, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion saying Britain's administration of the Chagos Islands was unlawful and should end. Britain ignored it. The military base, Diego Garcia, is still operating. The US uses it for military operations in the Middle East and Indian Ocean. The Chagossians are still in exile. Britain maintains that it will return the islands to Mauritius when they're no longer needed for defence purposes, which is diplomat speak for never. An entire population was ethnically cleansed to build a military base, and Britain won't even acknowledge it was wrong. And speaking of British military bases and questionable actions, let's talk about nuclear testing. Britain conducted nuclear weapons tests in Australia and the Pacific in the 1950s and 60s. They tested bombs in the Australian desert at Maralinga and Emu Field and on Pacific islands like Kiritimati and Malden Island. The problem was that these areas weren't empty. Aboriginal Australians lived in the desert regions where tests were conducted. Pacific Islanders lived on and around the test sites. Britain didn't properly evacuate people or warn them about radiation dangers. They told Aboriginal people to stay away from certain areas, but didn't explain why or ensure compliance. The result was that Indigenous people were exposed to radiation from nuclear tests. Some witnessed the explosions at close range. Others moved through contaminated areas afterward. The long-term health effects included increased cancer rates and genetic damage. Britain didn't properly clean up the test sites. Contaminated materials were buried or left in place. Some areas remain dangerous today. British servicemen who participated in the tests were also exposed to radiation. They were ordered to witness explosions at close range or to enter contaminated areas soon after detonation. Many weren't given protective equipment. The government denied for decades that these men had suffered health effects from radiation exposure. Veterans developed cancers and other illnesses. Their claims were dismissed. It wasn't until the 1990s that Britain began acknowledging the damage. Some compensation was paid, though victims argued it was inadequate. The Maralinga site in Australia wasn't properly cleaned up until the 1990s, decades after the tests. Britain left Australia and Pacific nations to deal with the radioactive legacy of British nuclear ambitions. Speaking of Britain leaving other countries to deal with problems, let's talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement again, but focus on Palestine this time. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. At the same time, Britain had promised Arab leaders support for Arab independence in exchange for their help fighting the Ottoman Empire. Britain made contradictory promises to different groups about the same territory. After World War I, Britain took control of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate. They tried to balance Jewish immigration and Arab concerns, failed at both, and created a situation where violence between Jewish and Arab communities became increasingly common. Britain restricted Jewish immigration, which angered Zionist groups. They allowed some immigration, which angered Arabs who saw their land being taken over. Nobody was happy. By the 1940s, the situation was untenable. Jewish militant groups were attacking British targets. Arab groups were attacking Jewish communities. Britain announced it would end the mandate and leave. The UN proposed partitioning Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The partition plan gave about 55% of the land to the Jewish state, even though Jews owned only about 7% of the land and made up about one-third of the population. Britain refused to implement the partition plan or to help with any transition. They just left in May 1948. Immediately, war broke out. About 700,000 Palestinians were displaced in what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. Entire villages were destroyed. People fled or were driven from their homes. The Arab-Israeli conflict that followed has killed tens of thousands and displaced millions. Britain created the conditions for this conflict through contradictory promises, colonial policies, and then abandoning the situation when it became difficult. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict continues today, killing people regularly, with no solution in sight. Britain's colonial legacy in Palestine is ongoing violence and displacement. And speaking of Britain's colonial mismanagement, let's talk about what happened in Cyprus. Britain took control of Cyprus in 1878 and formally annexed it in 1914. By the 1950s, Greek Cypriots wanted union with Greece, while Turkish Cypriots opposed this. Britain's response to the resulting violence was to implement collective punishment, detention without trial, and torture. The British established detention camps where suspected members of AOKA, the Greek Cypriot Independence Organization, were held without trial. In these camps, detainees were subjected to systematic torture. Methods included beatings, water torture, electric shocks, and stress positions. The torture was so widespread that it became a diplomatic embarrassment when details leaked. Britain also implemented collective punishment policies. If EOKA members came from a village, the entire village might be punished with curfews, searches, or detention of residents. The British would cordon off villages, round up all the men, and hold them for interrogation. This created resentment among the population and increased support for independence. When Britain finally granted Cyprus independence in 1960, they kept 2 military bases on the island as sovereign British territory. They also helped design a constitution that was so complicated and dysfunctional that it contributed to the island's later division. In 1974, Turkey invaded northern Cyprus. The island has been divided ever since, with Turkish Cypriots in the north and Greek Cypriots in the south. Britain's colonial legacy in Cyprus is ongoing division and conflict. Speaking of ongoing conflicts, let's discuss Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, British ships transported approximately 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. This was about 26% of all enslaved people transported during the entire slave trade. British ships were purpose-built for maximum cargo capacity, which meant maximum human suffering. The conditions on slave ships were beyond horrific. Enslaved people were packed into cargo holds with barely enough room to lie down. They were chained together. The ventilation was minimal. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. Many died during the voyage, a passage that could take months. The dead were thrown overboard. Mortality rates on some voyages exceeded 20%. British ports, like Liverpool, Bristol, and London, grew wealthy from the slave trade. Ship owners, investors, merchants, and port cities all profited from human trafficking. The profits from slavery funded Britain's industrial revolution and helped make Britain the world's dominant economic power in the 19th century. The wealth that built grand buildings and fine estates in Britain came from the sale and labour of enslaved people. When Britain finally abolished the slave trade in 1807 and then abolished slavery in British colonies in 1833, the government didn't compensate the enslaved people who'd been freed. They compensated the slave owners for their loss of property. The British government borrowed £20 million, about 40% of the national budget, to pay compensation to slave owners. That's equivalent to billions of pounds today. British taxpayers were still paying off this debt until 2015. Let that sink in. Until 2015, British taxpayers were paying off a loan that was used to compensate people for losing their human property. The enslaved people received nothing. Their descendants received nothing. But the people who'd owned them got paid handsomely. And Britain presents the abolition of slavery as a proud moment in British history, conveniently ignoring that Britain was one of the largest slave-trading nations and that abolition came with compensation for slavers. And speaking of compensation, Let's talk about what Britain did after slavery was abolished. They didn't stop exploiting colonial labor, they just changed the system. Britain developed a system of indentured labor that was slavery by another name. After abolition, British colonies still needed cheap labor for plantations. The solution was to bring workers from India and China under contracts that bound them to work for years. These indentured laborers were shipped to the Caribbean, South Africa, Fiji, and other colonies. They signed contracts, often without understanding the terms, that bound them to work for 5 to 10 years. The conditions were brutal. They worked long hours in terrible conditions for minimal pay. They lived in camps controlled by plantation owners. If they tried to leave, they could be imprisoned. The system transported over 1 million Indians to British colonies as indentured labor. Tens of thousands of Chinese workers were similarly transported. The mortality rates were high. The working conditions were often worse than what enslaved people had experienced, because plantation owners had no financial investment in keeping indentured workers alive long term. If a worker died, they could simply bring in another. Britain ended the indentured labour system in 1917, but only after it had transported millions of workers and created diaspora populations across its empire. The descendants of indentured labourers still live in places like Fiji, Trinidad, Guyana, and South Africa, often facing discrimination and poverty as a direct result of Britain's labour trafficking system. Speaking of trafficking, let's discuss the opium trade with China again, but focus on the domestic impact in Britain. While Britain was forcing opium on China, opium use in Britain itself was completely legal and widespread. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was sold over the counter in pharmacies. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and to quiet crying babies. The problem was that opium is highly addictive. Victorian Britain had a significant opium addiction problem, but it was mostly hidden because opium use was legal and socially acceptable. Women were particularly likely to use laudanum, partly because it was one of the few painkillers available for menstrual cramps and childbirth pain. Working-class mothers gave opium to their babies to keep them quiet while the mothers worked. Infant mortality from opium was common. Mothers would give babies too much laudanum, and the babies would die, or babies would become addicted and die from withdrawal when the laudanum ran out. The exact death toll is unknown because infant mortality was so high for many reasons that opium deaths often weren't specifically recorded. Britain didn't regulate opium until the early 20th century. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 required opium products to be labelled, but didn't restrict sales. It wasn't until the 1920 Dangerous Drugs Act that opium became a controlled substance. For over a century, Britain had legal opium addiction, while simultaneously forcing opium on China through military action. The hypocrisy was stunning. And speaking of Victorian-era health problems, let's talk about child labour in coal mines again, but focus on the specific horrors. Children working in mines didn't just pull coal carts, they worked as trappers, sitting alone in darkness for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing ventilation doors. These children were as young as 5 years old. They sat in complete darkness, sometimes for the entire shift, opening a door when they heard a cart approaching. The psychological impact of sitting alone in darkness for 12 hours as a small child is hard to imagine. Many trappers developed mental health problems. The isolation, darkness, and fear of being forgotten underground traumatized children. Some fell asleep at their posts and were injured or killed when carts came through closed doors. Children also worked as hurriers and thrusters, crawling through tunnels too narrow for adults, pulling or pushing coal carts. They wore a belt around their waist, attached to a chain that connected to the cart. They crawled on hands and knees through water, coal dust, and sometimes past dead bodies of miners who'd died in collapses. The tunnels were often less than 2 feet high. Children developed spinal deformities from crawling. Their growth was stunted. their lungs were destroyed by coal dust. Girls and young women worked in mines too, often half naked because of the heat. They suffered the same respiratory diseases and deformities as boys, plus the additional danger of sexual assault from adult miners. The 1842 Mines Act prohibited women and girls from working underground, but enforcement was lax. Boys under 10 were also prohibited, but many mine owners ignored the law. It took decades and additional legislation before child labor in mines actually stopped. Speaking of exploitation of children, let's discuss the British use of child soldiers in colonial wars. During various colonial conflicts, the British Army recruited and used child soldiers, particularly in Africa and Asia. Boys as young as 12 or 13 were recruited as drummers, buglers, and soldiers. In some cases, local boys were recruited or conscripted to serve in colonial military units. These child soldiers faced the same dangers as adult soldiers. They were shot at, killed in battle, and died from disease. The British justified using children by claiming it gave them useful training and employment. The reality was that children were used because they were cheap and expendable. If a child soldier died, it was less of a loss than an adult soldier who'd been trained at greater expense. The practice continued well into the 20th century. During the Malayan emergency in the 1950s, the British recruited local children into auxiliary units. During various African conflicts, child soldiers were used by British colonial forces. Britain only stopped using soldiers under 18 in combat situations in 2018, making it one of the last NATO countries to do so. And speaking of Britain's military practices, let's talk about the use of collective punishment as official policy. Throughout the British Empire, collective punishment was a standard tool of colonial control. If a village was suspected of supporting rebels, the entire village would be punished. Methods included destroying villages, confiscating property, imposing curfews, or detaining all adult males. In Palestine, during the 1930s and 40s, the British demolished Palestinian homes as collective punishment for attacks on British forces. Entire villages were destroyed with explosives. Families who'd done nothing wrong lost their homes because someone from their village had attacked British soldiers. This created more resentment and more violence, but the British kept doing it because it was easier than targeted enforcement. In Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, collective punishment was systematic. Villages suspected of supporting the Mau Mau were subjected to mass detentions. All the men would be rounded up, screened, and either detained or released. The screening process often involved torture. Villages were sometimes burned. Livestock was confiscated. The policy was designed to make supporting the Mau Mau so costly for communities that they'd stop. Collective punishment is a war crime under international law. It violates the Fourth Geneva Convention. But Britain used it as standard colonial policy for decades. The practice created cycles of violence where British punishment generated more resistance, which generated more punishment. It was counterproductive as well as immoral, but colonial administrators kept using it because it gave the appearance of doing something about rebellion. Speaking of war crimes, let's discuss Britain's firebombing campaigns in World War II more broadly. The bombing of Dresden wasn't unique. Britain systematically firebombed German cities throughout the war. The strategy was called area bombing, and it meant targeting residential areas rather than military or industrial targets specifically. The bombing of Hamburg in July 1943 created a firestorm that killed over 40,000 people in a single night. The heat was so intense that it created winds of over 150 miles per hour that sucked people into the flames. Bomb shelters became ovens, cooking people alive. The asphalt streets caught fire. People who fled into canals to escape the heat were boiled alive. The next day, rescue workers found the bodies of people who died from carbon monoxide poisoning in their shelters, their bodies perfectly preserved by the heat. The British bombing of Cologne, Essen, Dortmund, and dozens of other German cities killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The stated goal was to break German morale and reduce industrial capacity. Studies after the war showed that the bombing didn't significantly reduce German war production and may have actually strengthened German resolve. But it certainly killed vast numbers of civilians. Arthur Harris, the head of RAF Bomber Command, believed in terror bombing. He wanted to make German cities uninhabitable. He wanted to kill so many German civilians that Germany would be forced to surrender. His strategy killed over 400,000 German civilians, including tens of thousands of children. After the war, Germany was divided and occupied, and questions about British bombing of civilians became diplomatically inconvenient, so they were mostly ignored. And speaking of inconvenient questions about British military actions, let's talk about what happened to Italian prisoners of war in North Africa during World War II. In 1943, British forces captured thousands of Italian soldiers when Italy surrendered. These POWs were supposed to be protected under the Geneva Conventions. Many were, but some weren't. There are documented cases of British soldiers executing Italian POWs. Some were shot immediately after capture. Others were killed during transport. The most infamous incident was the Biscari massacre, where American soldiers under British command killed dozens of Italian and German POWs. While this particular massacre was committed by Americans, it occurred in a context where the summary execution of prisoners was not uncommon. British soldiers also killed German POWs. The most documented case is from after D-Day, where Canadian and British soldiers are documented to have executed German prisoners. Some soldiers kept tally marks of prisoners killed. Officers often looked the other way. The executions were against the laws of war, but they happened with sufficient frequency that they can't be dismissed as isolated incidents. After the war, very few soldiers were prosecuted for killing POWs. The focus was on prosecuting Axis war crimes, not Allied ones. The British government didn't investigate its own soldiers' actions thoroughly. The soldiers who executed prisoners mostly faced no consequences. Britain prosecuted Germans for war crimes while ignoring its own soldiers' violations of the laws of war. Speaking of things Britain ignored after World War II, let's discuss what happened to colonial subjects who fought for Britain during the war. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers served in the British Army during World War II. Soldiers from Africa, the Caribbean, and other colonies also fought for Britain. They fought in North Africa, Italy, Burma, and Europe. Many died, many more were wounded. After the war, these soldiers expected some recognition and perhaps political concessions. What they got was largely nothing. Britain didn't grant India independence until 1947, and that came after years of civil disobedience and pressure, not as a reward for wartime service. The partition of India, as discussed earlier, led to massive violence and displacement. The thanks Indian soldiers got for fighting for Britain was a botched partition that killed over 1 million people. African soldiers who fought for Britain returned home to colonies that were still under British rule. They'd fought for freedom in Europe while their own countries remained colonized. Some became involved in independence movements, using their military training to fight against British colonial rule. Britain ended up fighting against soldiers it had trained. Caribbean soldiers faced similar treatment. They'd fought for Britain, sometimes in segregated units, facing discrimination even while serving. After the war, they returned to colonies with limited opportunities. Many emigrated to Britain in the 1950s and 60s as part of the Windrush generation, only to face racism and discrimination in the country they'd fought for. Britain used colonial soldiers when it needed them and discarded them when the war ended. The promises of greater autonomy or eventual independence were vague and slow to materialize. Colonial subjects who fought for Britain learned that their loyalty wasn't valued and their sacrifices weren't appreciated. And speaking of the Windrush generation, let's discuss the Windrush scandal. In 1948, the British government encouraged immigration from the Caribbean to address labour shortages after World War II. People from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and other British colonies came to Britain legally. They worked, paid taxes, and raised families. Many had no documentation because they didn't need it. They were British subjects with the right to live in Britain. In 2012, the British government created a hostile environment policy designed to reduce immigration. The policy required people to prove their legal status to access healthcare, rent housing, or work. The problem was that many Windrush generation immigrants had no formal documentation. They'd arrived as children on their parents' passports. They'd never needed documentation before because their right to be in Britain was unquestioned. The government started detaining Windrush generation people, denying them healthcare, firing them from jobs they'd held for decades, and deporting them to Caribbean countries they'd left as small children. People who'd lived in Britain for 50 or 60 years were suddenly told they were illegal immigrants. Some were deported to countries where they had no family, no home, and no support. Some died in detention or after deportation. The scandal became public in 2018. The government apologized and promised compensation, but the compensation scheme has been slow and bureaucratic. Many victims died before receiving compensation. The government destroyed landing cards that would have proved these people's legal status, making it harder for them to prove their right to be in Britain. Britain invited these people to come, benefited from their labour for decades, and then treated them as criminals. Speaking of immigration, let's talk about how Britain treated Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s. As the Nazis ramped up persecution of Jews, desperate people tried to flee Germany. Britain could have saved many lives by accepting refugees. Instead, they severely restricted Jewish immigration to both Britain and Palestine, which Britain controlled. The 1939 White Paper limited Jewish immigration to Palestine to 75,000 over 5 years, after which it would require Arab consent. This was implemented while Jews were being persecuted in Germany. Britain was literally turning away refugees who would later die in the Holocaust. Ships full of Jewish refugees were turned back from Palestine. Some of those refugees ended up dying in concentration camps. Britain's reasoning was that they didn't want to upset Arab populations in Palestine by allowing large-scale Jewish immigration, so they chose to protect their colonial interests over saving lives. The Kinder transport did bring about 10,000 Jewish children to Britain, which was good, but Britain could have done much more. They chose not to. After the war, Britain continued to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine, even as Holocaust survivors languished in displaced persons camps in Europe. Britain detained Jewish refugees trying to reach Palestine and held them in camps in Cyprus. Some survivors of Nazi concentration camps ended up in British detention camps. Britain maintained these restrictions until it gave up the Palestine Mandate in 1948. And speaking of detention camps, let's discuss Britain's use of concentration camps in the Boer War in more detail. The camps weren't just overcrowded, they were deliberately kept in terrible condition. British Commander Lord Kitchener saw the camps as a tool to break Boer resistance. The suffering was a feature, not a bug. Food rations in the camps were intentionally reduced as punishment. If a family had men fighting with the Boer commandos, their relatives in the camps received reduced rations. This meant starving women and children to punish men fighting the British. Children suffered the most. They were more vulnerable to disease and malnutrition. In some camps, children under 5 had mortality rates above 60%. More than half the children died. The tents provided for camp residents were inadequate. They didn't protect against heat or cold. When it rained, the tents flooded. Sanitation was minimal or non-existent. Latrines overflowed. Drinking water was contaminated. Diseases spread rapidly through the camps. Measles would sweep through a camp and kill hundreds of children in weeks. Medical care was grossly inadequate. There weren't enough doctors or nurses. Medicine was in short supply. Sick children were left to die because there weren't resources to treat them. Emily Hobhouse reported seeing children with measles lying on the bare ground without blankets. She saw mothers holding dead babies, unable to bury them because there were no shovels. Britain knew about these conditions. Hobhouse's reports were publicised in Britain. The government was forced to make some improvements, but the camps continued operating. The British public was largely indifferent. Some defended the camps as necessary for the war effort. The Boers were the enemy, and their suffering was acceptable. Speaking of acceptable suffering, let's talk about British workhouses in more detail. We covered that they were terrible, but let's get specific about how they broke up families. When a family entered the workhouse, they were immediately separated. Husbands went to the men's section. Wives went to the women's section. Children over 7 were separated from their mothers and put in children's sections. Boys and girls were separated from each other. This separation was intentional. The theory was that allowing families to stay together would make the workhouse too comfortable. People might want to stay in the workhouse rather than finding work. So families were torn apart as punishment for being poor. Married couples might be housed in the same building, but wouldn't be allowed to see each other, except perhaps once a week for a short time. Mothers with babies or very young children could keep them, but once a child turned 7, they were taken away. Imagine being a mother in a workhouse, spending 7 years with your child, and then having them taken away to a different part of the building where you couldn't see them regularly. Imagine being a child, taken from your mother, and put with strangers in an institution designed to be as unpleasant as possible. The children's sections were often the worst parts of workhouses. Children were given minimal education, just enough to make them useful as labourers. They were subjected to harsh discipline. They were fed the same inadequate food as adults, which stunted their growth. Many children grew up entirely in workhouses, never knowing family life or affection. Some workhouses would hire out children as labourers. Factories and farms would pay the workhouse for child workers. The children received no wages. They worked long hours in dangerous conditions. If they were injured or killed, the workhouse would simply provide another child. The children were treated as commodities, sold by the workhouse to whoever wanted cheap labour. And speaking of child labour, let's revisit factory work, but focus on textile mills specifically. Children working in textile mills operated dangerous machinery for 12 to 16 hours a day. The machinery had no safety guards. Children's hands and fingers were constantly at risk. If a child lost fingers in a machine, they'd be sent home or moved to a different job that didn't require intact hands. The air in textile mills was filled with cotton dust and fibers. Children breathed this dust for their entire shift. They developed respiratory diseases. Byssinosis, or brown lung disease, was common among textile workers. It caused coughing, shortness of breath, and eventually death. Children who started working in mills at age 5 or 6 often died in their 20s or 30s from lung disease. The noise in mills was deafening. The constant clatter of machinery damaged hearing. Many mill workers went deaf. The heat was extreme, especially in summer. Children worked in temperatures over 30 degrees Celsius with no ventilation. They weren't allowed water breaks. They had to work through thirst and heat exhaustion. If a child fell asleep at their machine, they'd be beaten or have cold water dumped on them. Some mills employed people whose only job was to walk around hitting children who looked tired. The logic was that a scared, alert child was less likely to get caught in machinery. The reality was that exhausted children were beaten for being exhausted. Accidents were common. Children got caught in belts and gears. They were pulled into machines and crushed. They fell from platforms or were hit by moving parts. The factory owner's response was usually to fire the injured child and hire a replacement. There was no compensation for families who lost children to factory accidents. The child died or was maimed, and the family lost their income. Speaking of industrial accidents, let's discuss mine disasters in Britain. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, British coal mines experienced frequent disasters that killed hundreds of miners at a time. Explosions, floods, and collapses were regular occurrences. The death toll from mining in Britain during this period was in the tens of thousands. Mine owners cut corners on safety to maximize profits. Ventilation was inadequate, allowing explosive gases to build up. Mines were dug deeper without proper shoring, making collapses more likely. Warnings from miners about dangerous conditions were ignored. Mines that miners knew were unsafe continued operating because closing them would reduce profits. When disasters happened, the response was often to blame the miners. Inquiries would find that miners hadn't followed safety procedures, or that a miner had done something careless that caused the explosion. The structural problems, the inadequate ventilation, the lack of safety equipment, those were rarely addressed. Mine owners faced minimal consequences for disasters that killed their workers. After major disasters, there would be calls for reform. Sometimes regulations would be passed, but enforcement was lax. Mine owners would lobby against regulations or simply ignore them. Inspectors were few and often corrupt. Mines that violated safety regulations faced small fines, if any. The cost of compliance was greater than the cost of fines, so mine owners chose to pay fines rather than fix safety problems. The families of dead miners received little or no compensation. If a miner died, his family lost their breadwinner. They might receive a small payment from a charity fund, but there was no legal requirement for mine owners to compensate families. Widows and orphans were left destitute. Many ended up in workhouses because they couldn't support themselves after the family's wage earner died in a mine. Speaking of workers' rights, let's talk about the Tolpuddle Martyrs. In 1834, 6 agricultural labourers in Dorset formed a trade union to protest wage cuts. Their wages had been reduced to 7 shillings a week, which wasn't enough to live on. They organised to demand fair wages. The response was arrest and deportation. The 6 men were arrested and charged under an obscure law prohibiting the swearing of secret oaths. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to 7 years' transportation to Australia. Their crime was forming a trade union. The sentence was designed to terrorize workers and prevent union organizing. The message was clear. If you organize to demand fair wages, you'll be shipped to the other side of the world. The harsh sentences caused public outcry. There were protests and petitions. After 2 years, the men were pardoned and allowed to return to Britain. But the case showed how far authorities would go to prevent workers from organizing. Forming a union was treated like serious criminal activity. Workers who demanded fair treatment were punished as if they were violent criminals. It took decades of struggle before unions became legal and accepted in Britain. Workers fought for the right to organize, to bargain collectively, to strike. They were beaten by police, arrested, and fired from their jobs. Some were killed in confrontations with authorities. The right to organize wasn't granted. It was won through struggle against authorities who wanted workers to remain powerless and exploited. And speaking of exploitation, let's discuss the sweating system in Victorian London. The sweating system was a form of labour where workers, often women and children, worked in their homes or small workshops for piece rates. They'd be paid per item produced, and the rates were kept so low that they had to work 16 to 18 hours a day to earn enough to survive. Women would sew clothing, make matchboxes, or do other piecework in tenement rooms. They'd work by candlelight because they couldn't afford gas lighting. They'd ruin their eyesight doing detailed work in poor light. Their fingers would bleed from constant sewing. They'd develop back problems from hunching over work for hours. Children would help their mothers with piecework instead of going to school. Families needed every penny, so children, as young as 4 or 5, would help with simple tasks. These children grew up illiterate, working from the time they could hold a needle or fold a matchbox. The pay was so low that sweated workers could barely afford food. A woman might work 14 hours making shirts and earn enough to buy a loaf of bread and some tea. Rent consumed most of their earnings. They lived in one-room tenements, often sharing a room with multiple families. Disease spread rapidly in these overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The employers in the sweating system were often small contractors who themselves were being squeezed by larger manufacturers. The system created a race to the bottom where everyone was trying to reduce costs by paying workers less. The workers at the bottom of this system were paid so little that they were effectively working for pennies per day while ruining their health. Reformers tried to address the sweating system through legislation, but enforcement was nearly impossible. The work was done in private homes scattered across London. Inspectors couldn't check every tenement room. Even when violations were found, the fines were small and easily absorbed as a cost of business. The sweating system continued well into the 20th century, trapping thousands of workers in cycles of poverty and exploitation. And speaking of Victorian working conditions, let's talk about the match girls' strike of 1888. Match factories employed young women and girls to make matches. The process involved using white phosphorus, which is toxic. The workers would develop a condition called phossy jaw, where the phosphorus would literally rot their jawbones while they were still alive. Phossy jaw started with toothache. Then the gums would swell and develop abscesses. The jawbone would become infected and start to decay. Eventually, pieces of bone would fall out. The condition was incredibly painful and often fatal. In advanced cases, the rotting bone would glow in the dark from the phosphorus. Workers' faces would be visibly deformed as their jaws disintegrated. The match factory owners knew phosphorus was dangerous. They knew workers were developing phossy jaw. They didn't switch to safer alternatives because white phosphorus was cheaper. When workers complained, they were fired. When workers got too sick to work, they were replaced. The factory owners prioritized profit over the health of their workers, who were mostly teenage girls and young women. The Bryant and May factory in London employed about 1,400 workers, mostly women and girls. They worked 14-hour days for wages so low they could barely afford food. They were fined for trivial offences like talking or going to the bathroom without permission. The fines reduced their already meagre wages even further. When the social reformer Annie Besant wrote about the conditions, the factory tried to force workers to sign a statement saying they were treated well. The workers refused and went on strike. The strike succeeded partly because of public sympathy. The idea that teenage girls were having their jaws rot off to make matches for pennies generated outrage. The factory eventually gave in to some demands and stopped using white phosphorus. But it took workers literally losing parts of their faces before anyone did anything about the working conditions. Speaking of labour disputes, let's discuss the Peterloo Massacre in more detail. We mentioned it earlier, but let's focus on what happened after the cavalry charged. When the soldiers rode into the crowd, they didn't just disperse people. They actively targeted people, slashing at them with sabres. Witnesses described soldiers deliberately riding down fleeing people and cutting at anyone within reach. The crowd was packed so tightly that when people tried to flee, they couldn't move quickly. They were crushed against each other. Some were trampled to death. Others were pinned against walls or fences and cut down by cavalry sabres. A woman named Sarah Jones was killed along with her son. She was sabred while trying to shield her 2-year-old child. Another woman, Martha Partington, was struck on the head with a sabre and died from her injuries. The area after the massacre was described as looking like a battlefield. Blood pooled on the ground. Abandoned shoes, hats and clothing were scattered everywhere. The wounded lay where they'd fallen, groaning and crying for help. But the magistrates who'd ordered the cavalry charge prevented medical help from reaching the wounded for hours. They wanted to make sure all the protest organizers were arrested before allowing anyone to help the casualties. The government's response to public outcry over Peterloo was to pass laws making it harder to protest. The Six Acts of 1819 restricted public meetings, increased stamp duties on newspapers to make them too expensive for working people, and expanded the definition of seditious libel. Complaining about the massacre could get you arrested for sedition. The government's answer to soldiers killing peaceful protesters was to make protesting more illegal. And, speaking of government responses to dissent, let's talk about the Luddites. In the early 1800s, textile workers in England were losing their jobs to new machinery. Skilled weavers, who'd spent years learning their craft, were being replaced by machines operated by unskilled workers for lower wages. The displaced workers responded by breaking the machines. The Luddites, named after the possibly mythical Ned Ludd, organized nighttime raids on factories to smash textile machinery. They weren't mindlessly opposing technology. They were fighting for their livelihoods. They offered to negotiate with factory owners, asking for fair wages or training to operate the new machines. The factory owners refused, so the workers smashed the machines that were taking their jobs. The British government's response was to make machine breaking a capital offence. Breaking a textile machine could get you hanged. The government sent thousands of troops to areas with Luddite activity. There were more British soldiers deployed against Luddites in England than were fighting Napoleon in Spain at the same time. The government treated workers defending their livelihoods as a bigger threat than the French Empire. Luddites who were caught were tried and either hanged or transported to Australia. The York trials of 1813 resulted in 17 men being executed and many more transported. Their crime was breaking machines. The government prioritized the property rights of factory owners over the lives and livelihoods of workers. The message was clear: industrialization would proceed regardless of how many workers it impoverished, and resistance would be met with execution. Speaking of executions, let's revisit public hangings, but focus on execution methods. Before the long drop method was developed in the 1870s, most hangings involved short drops that caused death by strangulation rather than broken necks. The condemned would be placed on a cart or platform with a noose around their neck, and then the cart would be driven away or the platform would drop a short distance. Death by strangulation could take 10 to 20 minutes. The condemned would kick and struggle, a phenomenon called the hangman's dance. Their face would turn purple, their eyes would bulge, they'd lose control of their bladder and bowels, and the crowd would watch all of this as entertainment. Some people brought opera glasses to get a better view of the condemned person's face as they died. Family members or friends would sometimes pull on the condemned person's legs to speed up death. The hangman might do the same if he felt merciful, but often the condemned was just left to strangle slowly while thousands watched. This was considered normal public entertainment well into the Victorian era. The bodies of executed criminals were sometimes sold to anatomists for dissection, as mentioned earlier. But before dissection, the bodies might be displayed publicly. The corpse would be left hanging for hours or days, or it would be tarred and put in an iron cage to hang at a crossroads. The rotting bodies served as warnings to others. They also served as landmarks. People would give directions based on where corpses were displayed. And speaking of corpse disposal, let's talk about the Great Plague of 1665 and London's response. The plague killed about 100,000 people in London, roughly a quarter of the city's population. The disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded, unsanitary city. The government's response was to lock infected people in their homes and mark the doors with red crosses. If someone in a household developed plague symptoms, the entire household would be locked in their house by order of the authorities. Guards were posted outside to prevent anyone from leaving. The household would be locked in with a sick person, who was likely to die and who might infect everyone else in the house. Families were trapped in houses with corpses, surrounded by disease, unable to escape. The bodies of plague victims were collected at night by dead carts. Workers would go through the streets calling, "Bring out your dead," and bodies would be thrown onto carts and taken to plague pits for mass burial. The plague pits were huge trenches where hundreds of bodies were dumped and covered with lime. Some people who'd merely fainted or fallen unconscious from illness were thrown into plague pits while still alive. The wealthy fled London, leaving the poor to face the plague. The king and court left the city. Anyone who could afford to get out did. The people left behind were those too poor to leave, and they died in huge numbers. The disease burned through the cramped, filthy neighborhoods where the poor lived, while the wealthy sat safe in their country estates. Speaking of disease, let's discuss cholera in Victorian London in more detail. Cholera hit London in several epidemics during the 1800s. The disease spread through contaminated water, though this wasn't understood at first. The symptoms were horrific. Violent diarrhea and vomiting would dehydrate people rapidly. Victims would turn blue from lack of oxygen. They'd be dead within hours of showing symptoms. Dr. John Snow famously traced the 1854 Broad Street cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump. He proved that cholera spread through water, not air. But even after Snow's discovery, authorities were slow to act. Improving water supplies and sewage systems was expensive. It would require massive public works projects. The government didn't want to spend the money, so cholera kept killing people. The poor suffered most because they had the worst access to clean water. They drew water from the Thames or from wells contaminated by sewage. They died in huge numbers while the government debated whether to invest in sanitation. It took the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell forced Parliament to act, before London's water and sewer systems were properly upgraded. Even after the sewer system was built, poor neighborhoods still had inadequate access to clean water. The wealthy got piped water to their homes. The poor had to use communal standpipes or wells. The difference in water access literally meant the difference between life and death during cholera outbreaks. And speaking of public health disasters, let's talk about the 1952 Great Smog of London. In December 1952, a combination of cold weather, windless conditions, and coal smoke created a smog so thick that people couldn't see more than a few feet. The smog lasted 5 days and killed at least 4,000 people immediately. Another 8,000 to 12,000 died in the following months from respiratory problems caused by the smog. The smog was caused by coal burning. Every home, factory, and power station in London burned coal for heat and energy. The smoke and sulfur dioxide created a toxic fog that settled over the city. People breathing the smog inhaled soot, tar, and sulfur dioxide, their lungs filled with pollutants. People with respiratory conditions died first, but even healthy people were affected. The smog was so thick that public transport stopped running because drivers couldn't see. Ambulances couldn't respond to emergencies. People got lost walking home from work because they couldn't see landmarks. Some fell into the Thames because they couldn't see the riverbank. The air inside buildings was barely better than outside. The smog seeped through windows and doors. The government initially tried to downplay the death toll. They didn't want to acknowledge that industrial pollution had killed thousands of people. It took years of pressure before they passed the Clean Air Act of 1956, which restricted coal burning in cities. But the act was weakly enforced, and it took decades before London's air quality improved significantly. Speaking of environmental disasters, let's discuss Britain's role in deforestation around the world. The British Empire required enormous amounts of timber for shipbuilding, construction, and fuel. British colonial authorities systematically stripped forests in India, Africa, the Caribbean, and other colonies. The environmental impact was catastrophic and permanent. In India, British authorities cleared forests for timber and to create agricultural land for cash crops. Forests that had stood for thousands of years were cleared in decades. The deforestation causes soil erosion, disrupted water cycles, and destroyed habitats. Species went extinct. Local communities that had depended on forests for resources lost their livelihoods. In the Caribbean, British sugar plantations required cleared land. Entire islands were deforested. The loss of forest cover changed rainfall patterns and made hurricanes more destructive. The soil quality degraded without forest cover, but the plantation owners didn't care about long-term environmental damage. They extracted profit and moved on. British demand for timber was so high that forests in Britain itself had been largely cleared by the 18th century. So Britain turned to colonial forests. British companies would arrive, clear-cut forests, ship the timber to Britain, and leave devastated landscapes behind. The environmental impact of British colonialism included permanent ecological damage across multiple continents. And speaking of permanent damage, let's talk about Britain's nuclear tests in the Pacific again, but focus on the long-term contamination. Britain detonated nuclear weapons at Christmas Island, Malden Island, and other Pacific locations. The radiation from these tests contaminated land, water, and marine life. The contamination persists today, over 60 years later. The local populations were exposed to radiation. Many developed cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. Their children showed higher rates of birth defects and genetic abnormalities. Britain denied for decades that the tests had caused health problems. They classified documents about radiation exposure. They refused to compensate victims. The test sites remain contaminated. Some areas have radiation levels too high for safe human habitation. Marine life in the areas shows genetic mutations and contamination. The coconut crabs on some islands are still radioactive. Britain detonated nuclear weapons, contaminated entire island ecosystems, and then abandoned them. Pacific Islanders who were relocated for the tests were often not allowed to return home, even after the test ended. Their islands were too contaminated. They became permanent exiles from their homelands. Britain destroyed their homes and gave them minimal compensation. The environmental crime of these tests compounds the human rights violations against the islanders. Speaking of human rights violations, let's discuss Britain's involvement in the slave trade in more detail, specifically focusing on the Royal African Company. The Royal African Company was chartered in 1660 and given a monopoly on British slave trading. The company was backed by the royal family. It branded enslaved people with its initials using hot irons. The company transported about 150,000 enslaved Africans to the Americas. The death rate during transport was about 20%. That means the company killed about 30,000 people through the brutal conditions on its ships. And this was just one company. Multiple companies and independent traders participated in the British slave trade, collectively transporting over 3 million enslaved people. The enslaved people were branded like cattle. They were chained in cargo holds. They were forced to lie in their own waste. Disease spread rapidly. Dead bodies were thrown overboard. Sharks followed slave ships because there was always a steady supply of bodies. This was legal, profitable, and supported by the British government and royal family. When enslaved people rebelled on ships, the rebellions were crushed with extreme violence. Rebels were tortured and killed as examples to the others. Some were thrown overboard alive. Some were whipped to death. The captain and crew who committed these murders faced no legal consequences. Enslaved people weren't considered humans with rights. They were property. And speaking of rebellions, let's discuss the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica in 1865. Formerly enslaved people in Jamaica were technically free after 1838, but they lived in poverty while white landowners controlled the economy. When people protested unfair treatment, the governor declared martial law and unleashed brutal repression. Governor Edward Eyre authorized indiscriminate killings. Over 400 people were executed, many without trial. Another 600 were flogged. Thousands of homes were burned. The repression was far out of proportion to the rebellion, which had killed about 25 people. Eyre's forces killed 16 times as many people in response. The executions weren't formal trials followed by hangings. They were summary executions. Soldiers would round up men, sometimes chosen randomly, and shoot or hang them. One man was hanged from a tree in front of his wife and children. Another was flogged 100 times, which typically killed people, and then hanged. The violence was designed to terrorize the population into submission. Eyre was recalled to Britain and faced controversy. Some called for his prosecution for murder. Others defended him as having maintained order. He was never prosecuted. He lived comfortably in Britain until his death. The message to colonial populations was clear. Rebellion would be met with massacres, and the people ordering the massacres would face no consequences. Speaking of massacres, let's discuss the Croke Park massacre in Ireland in 1920. During the Irish War of Independence, British forces opened fire on a crowd watching a football match in Dublin. The Royal Irish Constabulary and British Army entered Croke Park and shot into the crowd. 14 people were killed, including 2 children. Another person died later from injuries. 60 more were wounded. The British claimed they were fired upon first and were returning fire. This was a lie. The crowd was unarmed. Witnesses testified that British forces arrived and immediately started shooting without warning. People ran for the exits and were shot in the back. Others were trampled in the panic to escape. Some of the dead were shot at close range while lying on the ground, wounded. The shooting was retaliation for earlier IRA killings of British intelligence officers. The British forces targeted a public sporting event to terrorize the Irish population. They shot civilians watching a football match to make a political point, and then they lied about it, claiming they'd acted in self-defense against armed attackers. No British soldiers or police were prosecuted for the killings. The British government defended the action as regrettable but necessary. The massacre galvanized Irish support for independence, but it also showed how far Britain would go to maintain control. Killing spectators at a football match was apparently acceptable if it served British interests. And speaking of Ireland, let's talk about the Black and Tans. During the Irish War of Independence, Britain recruited ex-soldiers to serve as temporary constables in Ireland. They were called the Black and Tans because of their mismatched uniforms. They were notorious for their brutality and indiscipline. The Black and Tans engaged in reprisal attacks against Irish civilians. If IRA members attacked British forces, the Black and Tans would retaliate by burning towns, shooting civilians, and destroying property. They operated with minimal oversight. Officers who tried to restrain them were ignored or transferred. The violence was deliberate policy designed to terrorize the Irish population. In one incident in Cork, the Black and Tans burned a large part of the city centre in retaliation for an IRA ambush. They set fires, shot at firefighters trying to put them out, and looted shops. Millions of pounds worth of property was destroyed. The British government initially denied responsibility, then claimed the fires were started by the IRA. Eventually, they admitted British forces were responsible, but claimed it was unauthorized. The Black and Tans killed civilians regularly. They'd raid homes looking for IRA members and shoot anyone who resisted. They'd set up roadblocks and shoot people who didn't stop quickly enough. They'd fire randomly into crowds. The official policy was to maintain order. The actual practice was state-sponsored terrorism. Speaking of state-sponsored violence, let's discuss the Amritsar massacre in more detail, specifically what happened after the shooting. After Brigadier General Dyer ordered his troops to stop firing, he didn't allow medical help to reach the wounded. He left hundreds of injured people lying in Jallianwala Bagh overnight without medical attention. Many, who might have survived with treatment, died from their wounds. Dyer also implemented a crawling order in Amritsar. He designated a street where a British woman missionary had been assaulted. Any Indian who wanted to pass through that street had to crawl on their hands and knees the entire length. The crawling order applied to all Indians, not just those suspected of the assault. Elderly people had to crawl. Sick people had to crawl. It was deliberate humiliation designed to remind Indians of their subordinate status. Indians who didn't crawl fast enough or who tried to stand were beaten. The crawling order stayed in effect for weeks. Thousands of people were forced to crawl through the street, humiliated and degraded because a British woman had been assaulted somewhere in the area. The order showed that British rule in India wasn't just maintained through economic exploitation. It required constant humiliation and degradation of Indians. And speaking of degradation, let's talk about how Britain treated Indian soldiers who fought in World War I. Over 1 million Indian soldiers served in the British Army during the war. They fought in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. They were paid less than British soldiers doing the same jobs. They were often given inferior equipment and supplies. Indian soldiers wounded in Europe were sent to segregated hospitals. They weren't allowed in the same hospitals as British soldiers. Some Indian wounded were sent to Brighton, where hospitals had been converted specifically for Indian soldiers. The segregation extended to death. Indian soldiers who died in Europe were cremated or buried in separate cemeteries, not alongside British soldiers. After the war, Indian soldiers returned home expecting recognition and possibly political reforms. What they got was the Rowlatt Acts, which restricted civil liberties and allowed imprisonment without trial. The British government's thanks to Indian soldiers who'd fought and died for Britain was more repression. The soldiers had been good enough to die for the empire, but not good enough to have political rights. Speaking of unequal treatment, let's discuss how Britain handled war crimes trials after World War II. Britain prosecuted Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg and in other tribunals. This was appropriate. The Nazis had committed horrific crimes, but Britain didn't prosecute its own soldiers for war crimes committed during the war. British soldiers had killed POWs, as mentioned earlier. British bombing had killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians in raids of questionable military necessity. British forces in Asia had committed various atrocities. None of this was seriously investigated or prosecuted. The focus was entirely on Axis war crimes. After the war, Britain also employed former Nazis who had useful skills or intelligence. Scientists who'd worked for the Nazi regime were brought to Britain to work on British projects. Intelligence officers who'd fought the Soviets were recruited to provide information for the Cold War. Britain's moral stance on Nazi crimes was flexible when it served British interests. And speaking of flexible morality, let's talk about Britain's arms sales to dictatorships during the Cold War. Britain sold weapons to numerous authoritarian regimes, including Saudi Arabia, Chile under Pinochet, and Indonesia under Suharto. These weapons were often used to repress civilian populations, but British governments approved the sales because they were profitable. British weapons sold to Indonesia were used in the occupation of East Timor, where Indonesian forces killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. British weapons sold to Saudi Arabia were used in Yemen. British weapons sold to various African dictatorships were used in civil wars and genocides. But the arms sales continued because they supported British manufacturing and provided diplomatic leverage. When human rights groups criticised the arms sales, British governments defended them as supporting British jobs and maintaining relationships with strategic partners. The fact that the weapons were killing civilians was treated as regrettable, but secondary to economic and strategic interests. Britain was willing to arm dictatorships and enable atrocities if it was profitable. Speaking of enabling atrocities, let's discuss Britain's role in the Rwandan genocide. In 1994, extremist Hutus in Rwanda killed approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in about 100 days. The international community, including Britain, failed to intervene. Britain was a permanent member of the UN Security Council and could have pushed for intervention. They didn't. When the genocide started, the UN had peacekeepers in Rwanda. The Security Council voted to reduce the peacekeeping force rather than strengthen it. Britain supported this decision. The commander of the UN force, General Romeo Dallaire, later said that a few thousand properly equipped troops could have prevented most of the killing. Britain and other Security Council members chose not to provide those troops. Britain's reasoning was partly financial. Peacekeeping operations are expensive, and Britain didn't want to pay for intervention in a country with no strategic importance to British interests. The calculation was that 800,000 Rwandans weren't worth the cost of intervention, so Britain helped ensure that intervention didn't happen, and the genocide proceeded largely unimpeded. After the genocide, Britain provided aid to refugee camps where many genocidaires had fled. Some of the aid money ended up supporting the perpetrators of the genocide rather than the victims. Britain didn't adequately screen who was receiving aid or investigate how it was being used. The priority was being seen to help rather than ensuring the help was effective or morally appropriate. And speaking of questionable aid, let's talk about Britain's foreign aid to India, while simultaneously extracting wealth through colonial exploitation. Britain would provide small amounts of aid or famine relief to India, while extracting vastly larger amounts of wealth through taxation, trade monopolies, and resource extraction. The aid was a tiny fraction of what Britain took from India. British officials would point to the aid as evidence that Britain was helping India develop and modernize. But the reality was that British colonial rule impoverished India. India's share of global GDP declined dramatically under British rule. British policies destroyed Indian manufacturing and forced India to export raw materials while importing British manufactured goods. The aid was propaganda covering massive exploitation. After independence in 1947, Britain continued to frame its relationship with India as one of aid and assistance. But Britain owed India an enormous debt for centuries of exploitation. The wealth extracted from India helped fund Britain's industrial revolution and made Britain wealthy. The idea that Britain was generously helping India with aid ignored that Britain had become wealthy partly by impoverishing India. Speaking of impoverishment, let's discuss the Highland clearances in Scotland. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Scottish landowners forcibly evicted thousands of tenant farmers from the Highlands to make room for sheep farming. The clearances were brutal and destroyed Highland culture. Families who'd lived on the land for generations were given notice to leave, often with just weeks or days of warning. If they didn't leave voluntarily, they were evicted by force. Their homes were burned to prevent them from returning. Their possessions were destroyed. They were left homeless, with nowhere to go. Many cleared families emigrated to North America or Australia, joining the Scottish diaspora created by forced displacement. Others moved to Scottish cities where they lived in poverty. The clearances devastated Highland communities. The Gaelic language declined as speakers were dispersed. Traditional clan structures were destroyed. The landowners who ordered the clearances faced no legal consequences. They owned the land and had the legal right to evict tenants. The fact that this destroyed communities and caused immense suffering was considered irrelevant. Property rights took precedence over human rights. The clearances are still remembered in Scotland as a traumatic period of dispossession and cultural destruction. And speaking of cultural destruction, let's talk about Britain's role in the destruction of indigenous cultures worldwide. British colonialism systematically suppressed indigenous languages, religions, and customs. British authorities believed they were bringing civilization to savage peoples and that indigenous cultures were obstacles to progress. In Australia, British colonisers implemented policies of forced assimilation for Aboriginal children. Children were taken from their families and placed in institutions or with white families to be raised as Europeans. The stolen generations, as they're known, lost their languages, cultures, and connections to their families. The trauma from these policies continues to affect Aboriginal communities today. In Canada, Britain established residential schools where Indigenous children were forced to abandon their languages and cultures. Children were punished for speaking their native languages or practicing their religions. Many were physically and sexually abused. Thousands died in the schools from disease, malnutrition, or abuse. The last residential school didn't close until 1996. In New Zealand, British colonisers suppressed Maori language and culture. Maori children were beaten for speaking Maori in schools. Maori land was confiscated. Traditional practices were banned or discouraged. It took decades of activism before Maori language and culture began to be officially recognised and protected in New Zealand. British colonial authorities destroyed artefacts, burned books, and demolished religious sites across the empire. They looted cultural treasures and shipped them to British museums where they remain today. The British Museum is full of artefacts taken from colonised peoples, including the Parthenon marbles from Greece, the Rosetta Stone from Egypt, and Benin bronzes from Nigeria. And speaking of looting, let's discuss the sack of the Summer Palace in Beijing in 1860. During the Second Opium War, British and French forces looted and burned the old Summer Palace, a massive complex of palaces and gardens. The palace contained centuries of Chinese art, books, and cultural treasures. British soldiers spent days looting the palace before burning it. They took anything valuable: jade, porcelain, artwork, jewelry, gold, and silk. They destroyed what they couldn't carry. The burning of the palace was ordered as punishment for Chinese resistance. It was deliberate cultural destruction designed to humiliate China. The looted treasures ended up in private collections and museums across Britain. Some are still in British museums today. China has repeatedly asked for their return. Britain has refused, arguing that the artifacts were legally acquired as spoils of war. The fact that the war itself was fought to force opium on China apparently doesn't affect the legality of keeping looted cultural treasures. The destruction of the Summer Palace was one of many acts of cultural vandalism committed by British forces. Libraries were burned, temples were looted, cultural sites were destroyed. British colonialism wasn't just economic exploitation. It was cultural genocide, the deliberate destruction of conquered people's heritage and identity. So there you have it. 101 dark facts from British history that somehow didn't make it into the school curriculum. From literal mountains of shit in the Thames to concentration camps in South Africa. From forcing opium on China to letting Ireland starve while exporting its food. From using child slaves in factories and mines to testing nuclear weapons on indigenous people's land. Maybe if we actually taught this history in schools, we'd have a better understanding of why the world looks the way it does today. But that would require acknowledging that Britain's rise to power wasn't just innovation and pluck. It was built on slavery, exploitation, violence, and systematic oppression of most of the world's population. Sweet dreams.